pattern is nothing more than a translation between disciplines. It's a framework in which many forms of knowledge are fitted into relationship with each other. So trees are shaped by the wind, for example. So there's two different aspects to pattern. The first being the perception of existing patterns and how they function. And the second is the imposition of pattern on sites in order to achieve specific aims or ends. So what this means is we are either observing a pattern that's already existing, or we're trying to impose a pattern onto the site in order to get some sort of a gain from it. And from this translation of pattern, from what we see to what we're implementing, this is how we can gain new information about our site and how to apply design. This is how we're going to be making use of a lot of the patterns that we see in nature. So we're solving a problem by using pattern. We're taking what we learned from the patterns that we see in nature, and we're imposing it on the landscapes in our designs for positive gain, to produce more yield, more fertility, more diversity. And pattern is always a very reliable source of information. The pattern that exists in nature is one that will continue to be emphasized over time by nature. Once we realize this, our designs become much easier. So when we're working with nature instead of against it, we're going to have much, much better results. We've seen too that as we go down through a design, so from the top of a hill to the bottom of a hill, for example, or from upwind to downwind in a flat landscape, diversity and the complexity of the system itself is going to increase due to gravity or wind energy. So that's an important point to make too, is that very often we're talking about the slope, and so gravity is going to be moving a lot of this nutrient and everything. But when we're on a flat landscape, wind is the major mover of energy, not gravity. So in a very flat type of terrain, we need to be creating a lot of wind shelter. And the same goes for low islands as well. If you're designing on a low island, there needs to be a lot of wind shelter as well. So from either the wind or from gravity, depending on the terrain and the landscape that we're looking at, our options for nutrient accumulation and fertility result from being either downwind or downhill from an original source. So the further down the energy track we go, the more complex our systems get, the more possibilities we have to handle or to work with, almost to the point where there's so many options that we can't possibly take them all up. So if we look solely at water on a property, water is one of the elements that we want to look at initially. It is tremendously important in our designs. So we're always looking, because of this effect of gravity and slope, we're always looking for the highest, longest contour line that we can possibly find in order to hold our water in the highest possible position on our property. This is key. I'm going to repeat it just for emphasis sake. So we want to find the highest, longest contour line on the property and find that location to hold water so that we can make use of that water all the way downhill from that one position. So our options are limited in that one scenario of where to place that water, but it's probably the most important decision you're going to be making in your design. So when we look at the number of possibilities that we have and the number of options that we have, at the very top of a property, we might only have 2 positions to hold water. And then when we get down to the mid-slope, there may be increased amounts of positions to hold water. And when we get down even further, there are many, 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 many different positions that we have and many different options. There's even more options for water placement, and they get quite intricate when we get down this far down in the pattern. So we can think of it almost like the dendritic pattern of our root systems, where the water systems on our property at the top are going to be few but very large, and then mid-slope, they're going to be more numerous but slightly smaller in size. And then when we get down here, I just have to make these long to be able to reach down to this downslope portion, but they are going to be really quite small, but there are going to be a lot of different patterns here when you move downslope. So it's very similar to the roots of a tree when we think about the number of options that we have. So as you get more options, you also get more fallback positions. So you're going to end up with a situation where maybe you're storing water over here, but then that dries up, so then you can store water over here or over here or over here. There's many, many, many different options at that point. So I'd like you to think a little bit about what kind of patterns you've noticed in nature or on your own property. One example of patterns that I noticed recently was I have planted a lot of sea buckthorn plants on my property, probably close to 300 of them or so. And since I planted a lot of my shelter belt and a lot of my trees, it really hasn't rained in 3 years. So I'm just making sure that as many of them as possible can survive, but they're not really thriving. My land is quite flat, and I haven't had the opportunity to really solidify a good water system yet. It's in the works, but I keep changing my mind and trying to figure out a better way of doing it. And although there are some swales in place and everything too, of course the swales only work when there is some water to actually collect in the swales in the first place. And I have over 1,000 trees in my shelter belt, so it's very difficult to water them by hand. Actually, it's impossible. So I've just planted very drought-resistant trees, and they're surviving. They're not thriving, but they're surviving. So I was looking at my sea buckthorn plants, and especially in this one area, I wanted them kind of close to the house so that they were easy to pick, and they were going to create a bit of a wind shelter for my garden as well. And they're doing well. They're probably about 4 or 5 feet high, and they've lived on complete and total neglect with the prairie grasses growing up around them and everything. But I haven't seen any fruit yet. So I contacted the company that I got them from just to double check that they weren't all male plants or something along those lines, because sea buckthorn has both male plants and female plants. And they assured me that they would have been a mix of the two. So especially with the quantity that I had acquired, there should have been definite fruit production by now. And so my thoughts were that they were just in such poor conditions that they're just not bearing fruit the way that I would like them to. And the sea buckthorn plants are from the same plant family, the Oleaster family, that's very similar to the buffalo berries that we have growing everywhere around us in southern Saskatchewan. So I started to drive around my area and really look at where do the buffalo berries thrive? Where do they like to grow? What kind of conditions are best for them? And when I started to look at that, they are always on slopes. So they'll be on a slope that's going down into a ditch, for example. They'll be in gullies. I have a really beautiful patch down in my valley right at the bottom. So they're not sitting in water, but they're up on like a little bit of like a crested hill. So in the springtime, they would get lots of moisture, but they would drain really well. So noticing these patterns of where these bushes really like to grow, I realized, okay, I should be planting my sea buckthorn and my buffalo berries on a slope somewhere where they're receiving a lot of the water, but it's able to drain away very quickly. And so, unfortunately, the ground is covered in snow right now, and I haven't had a chance to move any of the bushes or plant new ones. But in the springtime, I'm going to be planting a lot of my sea buckthorn plants or transplanting them basically onto a lot of these slopes where there's already buffalo berries, or in a location where buffalo berries already grow, in hopes of producing fruit faster than I would by sticking them up on top of a hill where they are right now. So that's just an example of how to see patterns in nature and incorporate them into your design. And it's a constant learning process. You're constantly going to be adjusting and fixing and moving. And a lot of it is just learning from your own mistakes, like looking at those sea buckthorn bushes that I had and realizing they're not growing as fast as they could be. Something is wrong. I have not done a good job of looking at nature and figuring out what they need and where they need to be. And then it's just a matter of making those kind of adjustments.